We last left off with the Sicilian and Capuan envoys voicing complaints in front of the Roman Senate. The decision was made to have Marcellus remain in Italy and take charge of the legions opposite Hannibal. The consuls then set about the business of raising new legions. A total of 21 legions would take the field, with at least 200,000 soldiers under arms. The Roman Senate also needed to supply the fleet with additional resources, especially rowers. However, the Roman treasury was nearly depleted. So the consuls ordered private individuals to, quote, furnish seamen in proportion to their income and their rank, as they had done on previous occasions, and also to supply the Roman rowers with 30 days' provision and pay, end quote. There was a great deal of resentment at this order, as many Roman citizens thought this time the consuls had gone too far. Livy quotes one citizen as saying, quote, after being drained by the war tax for so many years, we have nothing left but the barren wasted soil. Our houses have been burnt by the enemy, our slaves who tilled our fields have been appropriated by the state, first buying them for a few coppers to make soldiers of them, and now requisitioning them for seamen. Whatever silver or gold we had has been taken to pay the rowers and furnish the annual war tax. No resort to force, no exercise of authority can compel us to give what we do not possess. Let the consuls sell our goods, then let them glut their rage on our bodies, which are all we have left. Nothing remains of which we can even ransom ourselves. The consuls convened a special session in the Senate to discuss the matter. The overall feeling was that a fleet was absolutely imperative, or the Roman army might lose control of Sicily. And even worse, supplies might reach Hannibal. But how to outfit a fleet when no money was available, and with the citizens of Rome on the verge of revolt? Consul Valerius Laevinus came up with a plan and spoke before the Senate. Quote, as the consuls take precedence of the Senate, and the Senate of the people in honor and dignity, so they ought to lead the way in discharging unpleasant and difficult tasks. If in laying any obligation on an inferior, you have first decided that it is binding on you and those connected with you, you will find that all are more ready to obey you. They do not feel an expense to be burdensome when they see each of their leaders bearing more than his due share of it. We want the Roman people to have fleets and to equip them. We want each citizen to furnish rowers and not to shirk his duty. Then let us impose the burden on ourselves first of all. Let us, every one of us, bring our gold and silver and bronze money tomorrow to the treasury. What a clever little speech by Laevinus. He played the oldest trick in the book, the guilt card, and sure enough, senators and citizens from the upper classes were now competing with each other to see who could donate the highest amount of gold. Problem solved. Fresh with new funds, the Senate was able to supply the Roman fleet with the needed rowers. After this incident, the Roman consuls departed for their respective provinces. Livy relates that the Romans were still filled with, quote, alternations of hope and fear, end quote. The reason being that Rome had suffered serious disasters in Iberia. But on the other hand, Roman legions had won hard-fought victories in Sicily and Capua. Still, there was widespread concern over the loss of Tarentum. The Carthaginians, too, were having mixed feelings about the war. They felt the capture of Tarentum had made up for the bitter setback at Capua. The recent successes in Iberia gave the Carthaginians a renewed sense of hope, especially with the destruction of 2 Roman armies, which resulted in the deaths of the Scipio brothers. Meanwhile, Laevinus had arrived in Sicily. His first task was to restore order inside Syracuse, which of course had recently fallen to the Romans. After this effort was completed, Valerius marched his legions to Agrigentum, where one of the last remaining Carthaginian garrisons in Sicily still held out. At Agrigentum there was a bitter rivalry going on between the 2 Carthaginian commanders, Mutinus and Hanno. Mutinus was an outstanding Numidian officer who was in charge of the cavalry, while Hanno was in command of the main garrison. Hanno decided to demote Mutinus and replaced him with his own son. Despite this demotion, the Numidians still supported Mutinus. An outraged Mutinus secretly contacted Laevinus. He opened the gates for the Romans, and soon the Romans were flooding into the city. Hanno initially thought this was just a riot that had been started by the angered Numidians. When he saw that Roman troops were actually marching through the main gate, he fled with Epicides to a small boat and made his way back to Africa. And with that, Laevinus took control of the city. He immediately executed the city's leaders. The rest of the city's population were then sold into slavery. All of the proceeds from the sale were sent back to Rome to bolster the state treasury. News of Agrigentum's fall spread fast throughout Sicily. Every remaining city in Sicily immediately declared for Rome. Livy relates that for all intents and purposes, the war in Sicily was over. The population was able to, quote, turn their attention towards agriculture, end quote. Any extra food produced from the harvest was dispatched back to Rome. Meanwhile, in Italy, Hannibal was finding it increasingly difficult to launch attacks without adequate reinforcements. Compounding the problem was the fact that he had to keep many of the cities that he had taken garrisoned. He was not about to remove these garrisons to bolster his army for fear that it would start a widespread revolt. In addition, there were many towns loyal to Hannibal that didn't even have a garrison. He was in no position to remove these troops from his already weakened army by placing garrisons in these towns. Hannibal still hoped the Carthaginian Senate would finally dispatch the critical reinforcements he needed for the desperate struggle going on in Italy. Meanwhile, Marcellus had joined his legions in Apulia. He took stock of the situation and decided once again it would be wise to avoid a direct confrontation with Hannibal. Instead, Marcellus opted for treachery. Therefore, he attempted to contact any city that showed signs of wavering in their loyalty to Carthage. The most promising prospect was the city of Salapia. According to Livy, the two most prominent citizens were Dacius and Blatius. Dacius remained loyal to Hannibal, while Blatius favored Rome. Blatius dispatched secret messages to Marcellus, but without the help of Dacius, any plan to hand over the city to the Romans would surely fail. Blatius decided to take a gamble, and he revealed his plan to Dacius. However, Dacius refused to betray Carthage and disclosed the plot to Hannibal. Both men were then summoned to appear before Hannibal to explain themselves, but surprisingly, Hannibal dismissed the plot as fake. Now, rarely will I dispute the ancient chroniclers, unless something seems utterly preposterous, and this is one of those instances. I find it difficult to believe that Hannibal would have dismissed such a specific report without at least some sort of investigation. I mean, it wouldn't have taken much of an effort to dispatch a scouting party in order to ascertain Marcellus's location. But if Livy is to be believed, Hannibal simply did nothing. I think it is quite probable that no such report ever reached Hannibal. In any event, when Blatius returned to Salapia, he continued on with his plot. Eventually, he succeeded in handing the city over to the Romans. The 5,000 Numidians assigned to the Carthaginian garrison were taken completely by surprise. To make matters worse for the Numidians, they were in no position to utilize their famous horses in such a confined space. Still, the Numidians refused to surrender, and they quickly grabbed their weapons to confront the Romans. They engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat, and died fighting almost to the last man. According to Livy, the loss of the Numidians was a far greater blow to Hannibal than losing the city itself. From this point on, the Carthaginians were no longer superior to the Romans in terms of cavalry. The loss of Salapia greatly concerned Hannibal. He was already keenly aware that many cities in Italy were wavering in their loyalty to Carthage, especially after the fall of Capua. Hannibal was now determined to regain the initiative. The problem was that two Roman armies stood opposite Hannibal in Apulia. As we know, one of the armies was under the control of Marcellus. The other army was commanded by the proconsul Centumalus. The two generals maintained an overall strength of 4 Roman legions, plus an equal number of allies. Thus, Hannibal was in no position to challenge such a sizable force. Soon, however, it was rumored that Hannibal had retreated to Bruttium, far away from Apulia. After receiving this news, Marcellus decided to move his army into Samnium. Here he attacked Carthaginian possessions, seizing 60,000 bushels of wheat and 28,000 bushels of barley. Still, it was a risky move by Marcellus, considering the fact that only one Roman army remained in Apulia. As I mentioned, that army was under the command of Centumalus. At this point, Centumalus decided to lay siege to Herdonia, a city that remained loyal to Carthage. Hannibal soon learned of the rumor that he was in Bruttium, but in reality he was still situated in southern Apulia. Through forced marches, Hannibal was able to set up camp near the Roman army at Herdonia. He quickly set up in battle order. Despite being outnumbered, Centumalus decided to accept Hannibal's offer. Livy indicates that this was a grave mistake, as the Roman general was, quote, far inferior in tactical skill, end quote. Centumalus arranged his army in 2 lines, and opened up the battle with an advance against the Carthaginian infantry. Hannibal waited until the Romans and their allies were fully engaged, and then sent his Numidian cavalry to surround them. Part of the Numidians attacked the Roman camp, which was left relatively unprotected. The others fell upon the rear legion and destroyed it. Soon the Romans fighting in the front line were surrounded. Livy relates that Centumalus was killed along with 11 other tribunes. Between 7,000 and 13,000 Roman soldiers were killed as well. The Romans who survived the onslaught dropped their weapons and fled in every direction. Most made it back to Marcellus and Samnium. Hannibal soon learned that Herdonia was in fact ready to betray Carthage. He was also certain that once he left the area, the city would not remain loyal. First, he rounded up the conspirators and had all of them executed. Hannibal had no available troops for a garrison, so the entire city was burned to the ground. The rest of the town's population was then forcibly marched to Metapontum, where they were resettled. The disaster at Herdonia sent shockwaves through Rome. Marcellus, however, seemed unconcerned about the loss. He quickly dispatched a letter to Rome in an attempt to restore calm. Marcellus reminded the Senate that he had fought Hannibal to a draw 3 times before, and that he still remained in control of a very powerful army. Marcellus also made it clear that he intended to seek out Hannibal and, quote, put an end to any pleasure he might feel to his recent success, end quote. Marcellus was soon able to make contact with Hannibal's army in Lucania. Livy writes that Marcellus, quote, encamped on a level ground in full view of Hannibal, who was occupying a hill. To show the confidence he felt, Marcellus was the first to offer battle, and when Hannibal saw the standards emerging from the gates of the camp, he did not decline the challenge, end quote. According to Livy, the battle lasted an entire day. Hannibal used mostly Spanish infantry and slingers. Even elephants were deployed against the Romans. Marcellus and Hannibal continually ordered in fresh troops as both sides fought each other to a standstill. Only nightfall ended the combat, after which both armies retired to their respective camps. The next day, Hannibal broke camp and marched back to Apulia. Marcellus followed up on Hannibal, but decided only to shadow him. Livy relates that, quote, for some days there were skirmishes between the outposts in which both cavalry and infantry took part, but no regular battle. In nearly every case, the Romans had the advantage. Both armies traversed Apulia without fighting any important action. Hannibal marching by night, always on the lookout for a chance of surprise or ambush. Marcellus never moving but in daylight, and then only after careful reconnoitering, end quote. Meanwhile, in Capua, Fulvius Flaccus continued on with his occupation of the city. He administered the sale of Capuan property and goods that had been seized by his legions. Fulvius soon became concerned that his army might get distracted by the, quote, attractions of the city, end quote. He decided to move his army just outside the main walls. Here he ordered his men to construct temporary huts made only of wood and straw. A small contingent of Capuans hatched a plot to burn the huts in the middle of the night. However, some slaves revealed the plan to Fulvius. Fulvius wasted no time and ordered his men back inside the city, and the gates were slammed shut. The conspirators were then rounded up and promptly executed. The slaves who revealed the plot were granted their freedom, as well as money and property. With the summer of 210 BC coming to an end, the Senate decided to hold consular elections for the coming year. Roman tradition held that both consuls should return to the Senate in order to administer the elections. The problem was that Marcellus was in no position to return to Rome. Marcellus had previously dispatched a letter to the Senate indicating that it was important for him to maintain contact with Hannibal. The Senate agreed that it would be unwise to recall Marcellus at such a critical moment. Instead, the decision was made to recall Consul Laevinus from Sicily. After receiving his letter of recall, Laevinus began to make preparations before heading back to Italy. He ordered a fleet of 50 vessels to raid the coast of Africa with the main purpose of capturing prisoners in order to gather intelligence. The task force landed off the coast of Africa near Utica. Here they captured several Carthaginians and then quickly sailed back to Sicily. The prisoners provided valuable information to the Romans. It was discovered that Carthage had raised several new mercenary armies throughout Africa. This was done in order to reinforce Hasdrubal Barca in Iberia. Hasdrubal was then under orders to link up with Hannibal in Italy. It was also learned that Carthage was constructing a new fleet for an all-out assault against Sicily. After learning of Carthage's plans, Laevinus handed over the army to his deputy and set sail for Italy. He informed the Senate that Sicily had been completely reduced, and there was, quote, not a Carthaginian in the island. Nor was there a single Sicilian amongst those who had been driven away who had not now returned. They had all been repatriated and were settled in their own cities and plowing their own fields. End quote. He also informed the Senate of Carthage's latest strategy. The Senate realized that there was no time to waste, and that Laevinus should return to Sicily in case the Carthaginians attacked. In the meantime, the Senate would appoint a dictator to administer the elections, since no consul would be present. Laevinus proposed that Messala should be appointed dictator. Messala was currently in command of the fleet at Sicily. The Senate, however, quote, asserted that no one who was outside Roman soil, in other words, who was beyond the frontiers of Italy, could be nominated dictator, end quote. Laevinus apparently was not too interested in hanging around for the political debate and returned to Sicily. As a result, Fulvius, who was in Capua at the time, was made dictator. Fulvius soon arrived in Rome to conduct the elections. Fabius Maximus and Fulvius himself were proposed as the candidates. Several tribunes opposed the election of Fulvius since he was currently dictator. They did not feel it was proper for the dictator to accept votes for himself. Finally, the tribunes decided they would abide by the Senate's decision. Eventually, Fabius Maximus and Fulvius were confirmed as consuls for the following year. Another controversy arose as well. This involved the election of the Curio Maximus. This was one of the priesthoods, though it was not nearly as important as the Pontifex Maximus. The candidate chosen was a plebeian named Atellus. The patricians bitterly opposed his candidacy, as no plebeian had ever held this office. The tribunes, however, supported Atellus' candidacy and appealed to the Senate for his confirmation. The Senate decided to let the Roman people decide the election. Soon Atellus was in fact confirmed as the next Curio Maximus. The Senate also decided to send missions to Africa. King Syphax, who had been persuaded to defect from Carthage, would be presented with gifts. Quote, the presents they took with them were a purple toga and a purple tunic. After their visit to Syphax, they were commissioned to visit other petty kings in Africa, and carry as a present to each of them a toga and a golden bowl. Missions were also dispatched to Egypt, to remind them of the alliance already existing, and to renew the friendly relations with Rome. The presents they carried to the king were a purple toga and a purple tunic, and an ivory chair. To the queen they gave an embroidered palla and a purple cloak. End quote. Finally, the Roman Senate decided to provide whatever assistance they could to the Roman troops still trapped in the citadel at Tarentum. Without adequate supplies, the garrison would surely fold. The Senate attempted to relieve the garrison by dispatching supplies from Sicily. A small squadron of 20 ships was dispatched to resupply the beleaguered troops. As the Roman vessels approached Tarentum, they were spotted by the Tarentine fleet. Livy relates the following. It so happened that the winds completely died down just as the enemy came into sight, and there was ample time to lower the sails and get the rowers and soldiers into readiness for an approaching conflict. Seldom have two regular fleets gone into action with such determination as these two small flotillas, for they were fighting for larger issues than their own success. The Tarentines hoped that as they had already recovered their city from the Romans after the lapse of nearly a century, so they might now rescue their citadel by cutting off the enemy's supplies after they had deprived them of the mastery of the sea. The Romans were eager to show by retaining their hold on the citadel that Tarentum had not been lost in a fair fight, but by a foul and treacherous stroke. So when the signal was given by each side, they rowed their prows straight at each other. There was no backing or maneuvering, nor did they let go of any ship when once they had grappled and boarded. They fought at such close quarters that they not only discharged missiles, but even used their own swords in hand-to-hand fighting. The prows were locked together and remained so while the hinder part of the vessel was pushed about by the oars of hostile ships. The vessels were so crowded together that hardly any missile failed to reach its aim, or fell into the water. They pressed forward front to front like a line of infantry, and the combatants made their way from ship to ship. Conspicuous among all was the fighting between the two ships, which had led their respective lines, and were first to engage. Quinctitius himself was in the Roman ship, and in the Tarentine vessel was a man named Nico Perco, who hated the Romans for private as well as public grounds, and who was equally hated by them, for he was one of the party who betrayed Tarentum to Hannibal. While the Roman commander was fighting and encouraging his men, Nico took him unaware and ran him through with his spear. He fell headlong over the prow. The Roman fleet soon lost heart after the death of their commander, as well as the capture of their flagship. The Roman vessels fled in every direction. As a result, no supplies reached the citadel in Tarentum. In the next video, we will cover the events for the year 209 BC.